In this extraordinary circumstance of COVID-19, speaking not to an audience but to the camera here, I'm going to tell the camera all about this most remarkable book. It's a book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which was published in 1543. And I'm going to try and explain why I think this is the most extraordinary book 500 years on, and how it's actually got a history of its own, and that history is still rolling on at 500 years and getting bigger and better as the years go on. The book, published in 1543, was really an intersection of the art of science, and it is still remarkable at 500 years. The front, one of the illustrations from this particular book is here, a very familiar one to all, and on the plinth is a Latin inscription, and it says, "Man lives through his genius, all the rest is mortal." And I think Vesalius knew himself that he had produced a winner when he published this book in 1543. He was a young man then, he was 28. He had been born in Brussels. He studied in Paris and at Louvain, which was the university town in Belgium. And then he moved to Padua, where he completed his studies, and he became the professor of anatomy at Padua. And in just 2 or 3 years, he actually completed this monumental work. And I hear you all say, all 2 of you, why? Why did I become so interested in this extraordinary book? And the answer is really from another book. This is Thomas Willis. Thomas Willis was an English anatomist who worked in Oxford, and he published this little book in 1664, De Cerebri Anatomiae, and it's one of my favourite books in the rare book collection. But in 2014 I was asked to talk about this book because this was the 450th odd anniversary, perhaps it was 350 anniversary of this book, and I was asked to talk at the International Society for the History of Neuroscience in a session that they were having on anniversaries, because the meeting was held in Louvain and it was the occasion of the 450th year of the death of Vesalius. And so in Louvain we were treated to an amazing historical review of Vesaliana and seeing where Vesalius studied and seeing the library and the De Fabrica, the original. This little book here, though, was what I discussed at that particular meeting, and it's an amazing book, and interestingly it's a pirated copy because Thomas Willis produced his book in London. It was published in quarto size, it was hellishly expensive, and so within a few months this little copy was published in Amsterdam, and we have this particular copy, a pirated copy from 1664. We still have this magnificent base of the brain, which was actually drawn by Christopher Wren, the chappie who did St. Paul's Cathedral, because he was working with Willis. He was a friend of Willis, and he drew this base of brain. So when the committee were looking to produce a seminar series last year, they wanted to look at how the brain had been illustrated for the last 500 years. And they thought that I had an interest in the base of the brain because I had produced this talk for the Thomas Willis book. And so they asked me to look at how the base of the brain had been illustrated for these 500 years. And Julie Price, our rare book librarian, and I put together an exhibition, because when I began to look at what the task for presenting this talk would be, I dialed up the catalogue of the Fisher Library and found probably about 100 books. And in the end, Julie and I got about 70 for display. Now, having done my talk for half an hour's talk, I thought, bugger this, I'm not going to put these books back on the shelf and for them not to be seen for another few hundred years, so we'll give them an airing, and that's what we've done. So we have this exhibition, and the exhibition looks at how the anatomists and their illustrators, and that's an important feature because these anatomists had a very close relationship with their illustrators, whether or not it was woodcut or engraving or photographs. It was a very intimate relationship between anatomists and illustrators. And we looked at how they demonstrated the brain and its nerves of special sensation, which are the nerves at the base of the brain. And as I say, the story includes a history of research endeavour, artistic styles, printing methods, and the trends in medical education, and a little bit of scientific plagiarism. And this is an example of the exhibition that we put together, and we've included the Willis book, and we've also included on the far left of this, obviously the copies that we have of De Fabrica. And this is our display of the De Fabrica, which shows our copy and also some unauthorized versions, but more later. And what I aimed to do was to look at how Vesalius in 1543 had looked at all of these nerves that come from the base of the brain, and how Professor Grant, the professor of anatomy at Toronto University, had done the same thing in 1943, and the changes that had occurred in that 400 years. But out of this collection, my favourite has always been De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Vesalius. And the more I thought about it, the more involved I became, the more I realised that this was more than just an extraordinary book. It had actually taken on a history of its own. And in 1543, this was certainly a revolution in scientific thought. And it also demonstrated the importance of anatomical illustration, because prior to that, Galen had been the authority, and Galen's book was completely without any illustration. So here we see the two components of Vesalius. On the left, we see the magnificent artistry produced by a fellow called Jan Caspar. He was from the school of Titian, a Renaissance artist, and you can see the fine detail of the Renaissance art. On the right, we've got the scientific component produced by Vesalius. He turned anatomy on its head at the time and is thought really to be the father of modern anatomy. Now, when William Osler, one of the greatest physicians, wrote in 1921, the worth of a book as of man must be judged by results, and so judged the Fabrica as one of the great books of the world, and would come in any century of volumes which embrace the richest harvest of the human mind. In medicine, it represents the full flower of the Renaissance. As a book, it is a sumptuous tome, a worthy setting of his jewel, paper, type, and illustration to match, a chef-d'oeuvre of any medical library. Couldn't have said it better myself. So this was Osler in 1921 when he realized the importance of this particular book. And the importance is actually written all over the front cover of this book. This is the frontispiece of Vesalius's De Fabrica. And you can see the very, very fine detail. This was done in drawing and then transferred to wood blocks. And every time I look at it, I think how amazing this is. But on it, it's got the history of anatomy. You can see this particular part of the frontispiece. We see Vesalius. Vesalius puts himself front and centre of anatomy. We see the corpse as the front and centre of anatomy, which was very, very unusual. Prior to this and prior to Vesalius's dissection, the professor of anatomy would sit on his chair behind the proceedings and read from the book of Galen, and the menials, who are now relegated to under the table, would then do the dissecting. And you can see the picture here with menials under the table, and the one on the right has a razor as part of the evolution of the barber surgeon. But Vesalius would have none of that. He did the anatomy himself, and this was the revolutionary feature. We see two illustrations of the importance of the body to Vesalius. and honouring the body in this frontispiece. And we see the animals that Galen had previously dissected to get his results. Galen hadn't actually worked on humans, and Vesalius realised this quite quickly when he did this work himself. The earliest copy we have in our Rare Books collection is a very interesting copy from 1725 by a group from the Netherlands, Boerhaave, who was then the most advanced physician for his time, and Albinus, who was a truly remarkable anatomist. And this is the frontispiece. You can see it's been changed because this particular book was done with copper engravings, a very fine example of copper engraving, but the rest of the book is taken straight from De Fabrica. And this is our copy in 2 volumes, and it is a very fine copy, and but it's engravings and not the original woodcuts. But as soon as Vesalius had published in 1543, unauthorized copies appeared very, very quickly, and Vesalius himself called these pirates, and he was far from happy. The first of these copies occurred in 1545, a mere 2 years after Vesalius's copy, and it was produced by an engraver, not a doctor, not an anatomist, but an engraver who had gone to work in London by the name of Thomas Geminus. And he produced this copy, and this is the frontispiece of his book. And remember, he himself was an engraver. So we have this newly elaborately engraved title page. And he re-engraved in copperplate 40 figures from the Fabrica and the Adam and Eve pictures from Vesalius' Epitome. His first edition was in Latin, but he recognised the commercial value if he made an English version, which he did in 1553, because our barber surgeons had no Latin. So when we compare Geminus with the Vesalius, we can see immediately that the pictures are very much the same, and they're generally condensed onto one page, which made it much easier and much cheaper, because he had the printing and he had the illustrations, and they were separate. The next major copy was from an anatomist called Valverde, and he was a Spanish anatomist, and this is the frontispiece of his, and you can see again it's an elaborate frontispiece, but certainly no place nearly as good as the original Vesalius. So he was a Spanish anatomist. He had studied at Padua at the time of Vesalius, but he was working in Rome in 1556 when he published his first edition. He too had 44 new copperplate engravings, and all but 4 were copied from Vesalius. And this was republished many times, Latin, Italian and Dutch. And here in the Rare Books Library we have this extraordinary copy from 1568, and it's in Dutch. It was produced in Antwerp, and it's a beautiful copy. And if we compare the Vesalius, the original De Fabrica, with Valverde, you can see that Valverde has certainly stolen or pirated the pictures from Vesalius. Vesalius was suitably outraged, and he declared that Valverde had never put his hand to a dissection, and ignorant of medicine as well as of the primary disciplines, and he undertook to expound our art in the Spanish language only for the sake of shameful profit. But regardless of all the pirating that went on, it really enhanced Vesalius's work, which was always recognised as the one that was by far the best. And if we compare the Valverde copies with the Fabrica at the back, you can see the difference in the fineness of the engraving versus the Valverde work. And again, you can see on the right-hand side here we have the original De Fabrica, which is so much better executed than the Valverde work on the left. Now, interestingly, when you copy, you reverse because you're using copying paper. And so you can pick up a copy immediately because they are reversed in the copying process. So in the background we have the Fabrica, and we have that famous drawing of the thinking skeleton. And you can see on the left-hand side Valverde's take on that. And you can see that it's smaller, shorter and simpler, and obviously too reversed. And another example here of one of the Vesalius muscle men we have on the right-hand side, and Valverde's copy on the left. No place near as intricate as the original Vesalius. Now, interest was always there on the Vesalius and De Fabrica, but in the late 19th century it became extraordinarily popular, promoted by Sir William Osler, again one of the world's greatest physicians. And he started buying Fabrica when they were very cheap. When he was on holidays in the Guernsey, he actually wrote back that I have bagged 2 1543 Fabricas. 'Tis not a work which should be left on the shelves of a bookseller. And he only paid really what would be a few dollars for the Fabrica at that time. He then collected his own Fabricas, and he usually actually gave them to various libraries. And McGill University, his alma mater, is endowed with quite a few first edition Fabricas. Lovely. Now, this all promoted Vesalius' work again. And so Osler and his colleague Harvey Cushing, who at the time was a very famous neurosurgeon, and he happened to be Osler's next door neighbour, they got together and with a group from Europe, and in 1912 they set up a committee because the plan was to have an enormous anniversary of the birth of Vesalius in 1914. So this was all planned in Belgium. It was going to be centred in Louvain. But on the 25th of August 1914, the Germans destroyed the ancient library of the University of Louvain. Here are some postcards that were actually made to distribute to the Americans in an attempt to finance the University of Louvain. But you can see on the left-hand side the original, and this was actually taken just a very short time before the Germans came through Louvain and destroyed the university. So these are only a few months apart. So this is the university on fire in 1914. They lost 300,000 books, including a lot of the very early pre-1500 books, and many of the original first edition De Fabrica. Osler was horrified. He wrote, "What a cursive act of vandalism to destroy Louvain. I would like to undertake with some friends to replace the books of Vesalius, who perhaps after Erasmus is the greatest name on their list." And this he did. He actually mounted a campaign to get universities in America to support the restocking of the Library of Louvain. And they did this quite successfully. And the library was rebuilt, but more about that later. Then the next in the timeline of the Vesalius' De Fabrica, in 1934, they took the original woodblocks which were identified from the library of the University of Munich. And this is an extraordinary story. A librarian working in the University of Munich in the late 19th century found some woodblocks and identified immediately that these were from the original Vesalius De Fabrica. The Library of the University of Munich then collaborated with the Academy of Science in New York, and together they produced an extraordinary volume called the Icones Anatomicae, which was a reproduction using the original woodblocks. And we fortunately have a copy which we'll show after the talk. So they produced this book in 1934, and they were able to reproduce the frontispiece from the original edition and from the second edition in 1555. However, during the war years in 1943, there was further disruption. And unfortunately, the woodblocks were returned to the University of Munich, and when the University of Munich was bombed by the Allies, they were destroyed. So the woodblocks were actually destroyed. So the book that we have here, the Icones, will never be able to be recreated because the original woodblocks, unfortunately, have gone. So when they went to celebrate the 400-year anniversary of the publication of the Fabrica, once again the war intervened and the Americans were unable to get to Europe and the celebrations were curtailed. But they did manage to produce this extraordinary book called A Biobibliography of Andreas Vesalius. It was published in 1943. It was written by Harvey Cushing, who did an amazing amount to squirrel out all of the copies of Vesalius's De Fabrica. He died in 1939 and this book was published posthumously. But this is an extraordinary commentary on all of the copies of Vesalius's De Fabrica. So they thought they'd have another go in 1964 at the anniversary of the 450th death of Vesalius, and they produced an anniversary facsimile copy of De Fabrica, and this was published in Brussels, where Vesalius was born. And we have this particular copy. It's a magnificent facsimile copy, and that was provided to the library as a gift from the friends of the library. And then in 2014, at the anniversary of the 500th anniversary of Vesalius's birth, a Kaga English edition was published, and throughout the world libraries, museums celebrated the occasion with special displays, and the event was actually quite massive. And it was to that meeting that I went to in 2014 in Louvain for the International Society for the History of Neuroscience that we celebrated the 500th year of the birth of Vesalius. Just one thing I forgot to mention with the war. With the war in the Second World War, the University of Louvain was again destroyed by the Germans, and again they lost their library collection, and it was again reinstituted by lots of donations from the American universities. And if you go to Louvain now, all over the pillars of the newly constructed library are the names of the universities and the schools that sent money to reconstitute the second time that the University of Louvain had been destroyed in war. So this is the copy from 2014. It's an English edition. It's extremely well done. It just shows the amount of effort that people have gone to highlight this copy. This is the copy. I of course don't like the pictures displayed this way. I think it's much nicer in the original 1543, but it's well annotated. It is in English. It's much easier to read, and it's a great resource for anybody who's researching this extraordinary book. And so in conclusion, I'd just like to say that this book, first published in 1543, was really an astounding book for its time. It represented the intersection of art and science. It represented the beginning of modern anatomical practice. And I think that it is still quite a remarkable book after 500 years. Thank you.
Could a professor of medicine teach from Vesalius's De Fabrica today?
Lots of people have tried. No, and this is the interesting thing about the 2014 volume, the annotated English, is that they have made it so that when people look at the drawings of Vesalius, they can see immediately where he might have been incorrect. My husband teaches anatomy and he often uses Vesalius as De Fabrica, but he often actually gets his surgical trainees to tell the problems, to pick up the where he might have been wrong. So yes, a professor of surgery actually used.
Could you tell us a little about the market for the original 16th century De Fabrica? Who were the main buyers and would they have used it at the operating table?
I don't know who the buyers were, but certainly it became very popular in libraries. I think it was one of those, perhaps it was one of the original coffee table books, because it was certainly very, very popular in libraries. I imagine that it was used, but again, it was a prototype really for how anatomy should be done. So I would well imagine that it was used as an anatomical text fairly well, and certainly used as a prize for any library, as it would be today.
I have a question kind of leading on from that. In terms of the way teaching and anatomical teaching anatomy advanced as a result of Vesalius's book, did anatomists after him all follow his lead and do the dissecting themselves, or did some still prefer to refer to Galen and do it the old-fashioned way?
When Vesalius' book was first published, there was some outcry from the traditional Galenists who followed Galen, and there was a lot of criticism about, how dare he, because Galen had been around for 1500 years, and suddenly this young upstart of 28 comes along and says, look, Galen was wrong. He operated on animals and there are many things that are incorrect. And so there was a lot of criticism at the time from various circles. But I think as other well-known anatomists continued and did their own anatomical dissection rather than slavishly following Galen, I think after that then it became quite obvious that Vesalius was on the correct path.
And one, I don't know if you guys have questions, but I've got one final one. I wanted to ask about the law as pertains to plagiarism at that time. Was there any?
There was absolutely none.
Right. Okay, that answers my question. If there was any safety net or recourse for authors whose work.
Well, I think all Vesalius could do was write letters to say how annoyed he was. But that only added to his own publicity, because his book was certainly better than the ones that had been plagiarized, the people who had plagiarized his work. And with the copies that were sold, the cheaper copies, obviously just made his so much better and more popular.
Okay. Any other remarks that you didn't get a chance to?
Well, I have one funny story. In 1914, when Cushing was unable to go to Brussels and produce to go to Louvain for the celebration, he decided that he would put up a stand at the American Academy of Surgery meeting, which was being held in America in 1914. And so he put up a big stand and he put a big label up, Vesalius, and he had his copies of De Fabrica there, and he was trying to show these surgeons this magnificent book. And somebody came up and said, do you have a sample? And he said, a sample? He said, this is Vesalius' book. We don't have any samples. And he said, oh. He said, I thought you were giving away samples of Vaseline. He said, no, it's Vesalius. But I think Vesalius' name would be more recognizable now.
Yeah.